welcome to everybody. It's very nice of you to be here and to be in this further debate as part of the COSMÓGRAF festival. We'd like to thank you for coming. We'll be talking about gender equality and limits of urgencies of the feminist debate. We'll be talking about many things that go beyond gender equality. Our speakers have prepared some presentations which will also go to talk about some current issues. I am Laia Soldevila. I am a writer and editor for the Critic magazine. I'll be really pleased to hear our speakers today. We have Begonia Said and we have Miriam Sola. They'll be talking about questions such as what are the debates that are taking place in feminism today and what has been the reaction to the advances that have been made in recent years and what have the policies of the authorities been in that time. We'll be talking about the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, that should be met by 2030. There is one on gender and what has been done to move in that direction. So we'll be talking about many issues. We'll be listening to presentations of around 50 minutes, and then we would like to listen to you, the audience, and hear your thoughts and questions. So we'll have the presentations, which should last around 50 minutes first. So without further ado, I'd like to present Begonia Sanz. She's a doctor in philosophy in the Autonomous University of Barcelona. She's a professor and coordinator of master studies and the doctorate in philosophy at the same university. Her research focuses on defining and representing identity, and she's part of the Body and Textuality research group, which gives an interdisciplinary perspective looking at the body as a place where issues of gender, ethnicity, race, class, and sexual identity impact on the body. She also looks at cultural issues. So she goes beyond the generic view of feminism. We have Miriam Sola, who did a degree in philosophy. She is a feminist activist. She has worked in many different feminist and lesbian and trans groups in Barcelona, and she has been working on the new discourses in the feminist movement and queer discourse. She has been doing political advice on the Spanish level and Catalan level. So these are pretty extensive CVs. We'll be talking about a lot of those issues. That's why I have introduced so much about their CVs at the beginning. So I think it would be useful to think about how did we get here? Where are we? Feminism is no longer an odd term for people. It's no longer restricted to the academic world or the activist world. Feminism is being talked about on the TV and in the radio and in articles. And we could say that there has been more discussion about it ever since the Me Too movement evolved in 2018 in the US, where women denounced the sexual assaults that they had suffered. And in that Western world that we live in, which of course is not the whole world, but we heard more talk about that kind of feminism. The first question I wanted to ask you is what has been made by that, what is left from that movement? And has that movement represented everybody, or has some sectors been left out of that movement? So what are the kind of debates that have taken place, and has certain debates dominated the feminist debate and left out others? Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks a lot to COSMÓGRAF to inviting me to come and to the Manresa Town Hall. And it's nice of you to have thought of us as speakers. Feminism has led some of the changes in collective mentality and mindset that that have been the most important in recent years. It has had an impact on common sense. It has provided analysis that has taken out of the shadows or the dark different kinds of sexual violence or gender violence. So Me Too allowed that to happen. For the first time, there has been a spotlight on sexual assaults. There had been a lot of talk about domestic violence and male violence, and there had been the passing of different laws regarding those, but until Me Too, there wasn't so much of a discussion about sexual assaults. And of course, we have in the Spanish case, the Manada case, the group rape case, and the feminist strike that started in 2018. There were 6 million people participated in that. In April of that year, a judge, or just after, a judge condemned for abuse and not rape those 5 members of the Manada, which means wolf pack in Spanish, and the whole country discovered what is patriarchal society. Feminists have been talking about that for a long time. We all went onto the street and we said that this wasn't an abuse, that this was rape. And in that same year, I don't know if you remember that performance that became viral. It came out of Chile. El violador eres tú. The rapist is you. And this was the arrival of the 4th wave of feminism. And what this had in common is putting the focus on sexual violence. Many women came out to explain their stories of suffering abuse and having suffered sexual assaults. I remember, and these have been hidden, I remember my mother suddenly told me for the first time in 40 years that she had suffered this at the hands of a neighbor, this person did this, and the media started changing their sensitivity towards the topic. We saw series on Netflix, we saw songs made, and many men also started taking on board this approach. And we are seeing feminist attitudes being normalized, but of course there was a countervailing influence, which was when the movement became strong. There was always the reaction to it, and the far right has been focusing on women's rights as a campaign issue for it, not just in Spain but internationally. And also the same with LGBT rights. So here there is an important issue, which is who is left out of that kind of movement. When we were preparing the debate, we said that we should talk about gender violence, but of course there's lots of kind of gender violence. What happens with trans women? What happens with women who are killed by men who are not there? They are not in a sentimental relationship with. The legal and political treatment of this issue focuses on a certain type of sexual violence, which is that takes place in a relationship. There hasn't been enough of a spotlight put on the other kinds of violences, on harassment at work, on the issue of having documents for migrants, and resources and access to houses, and also resources to escape from sexual violence. If you don't have a house, how do you escape from a violent relationship? Where are you going to go if you don't have a place to go to? So we are putting the spotlight on certain places but not on others. So sexual violence, I don't want to be mistaken here. I want this to be clear. When we talk about sexual violence, it is functional for the disciplining of women's bodies. There is a concept that Gail Ruby, talked about, which is sexual panics. Talking about that, she said, has certain unintended consequences, which actually include making women fearful. They don't want to go out of the home, and they don't go into spaces which are seen as attributed to men. And those states of sexual panics, these are concretized in laws. We have seen this with the persecution of sex workers as scapegoats. And a couple of months ago, a documentary called Porno Generation, Catalan documentary, Generación Porno, which was about sexualization by young people. And it almost seemed like a crime series. There's this panic that's created. There's issues of censorship. You're dealing with a lot of issues here. You're really opening up a lot of issues here. But the focus is on sexual violence and everything that's meant. And there's been such a big reaction to that, but also we've never had the focus on these issues before. I first of all want to share the thanks that were shared by Miriam. For many years in academia and in activism, I have come to have a similar view. For me, a very feminist gesture is trying to see what is the opposite of what can be have a critical appearance. There's always a danger, and there's often a danger. And this is one of the important tasks for feminism, is to make sure that some of our critical discourses don't encourage other problems, like you have mentioned about talking about sexual assaults, creating fear. So when we talk about sexual violence, that can have some dangers. It's not enough to just talk about these. No, but it's not just about these not being enough. It's about also creating some perils. So talking about Me Too, Fox News presenters exposed some abuse that had been performed by Roger Ailes. They accused him of sexual harassment over a whole decade. We have known cases of people, from opera singers to members of the British royal family, and also, and maybe some of these cases seem a long way away, but there's also some local academics that have been doing what was treated as criminal behaviors, but there weren't any protocols in their institutions to stop this gender violence. That said, what Me Too has provided in a positive way is showing that there's an ideological so if we take into account all the positive sides of Me Too, we can also look at the critical sides, or the less positive side. The background to it is neoliberal. It repeats some of the ideas that were existing in the equality feminism of the early part of the 20th century. So the complaints that Me Too are making are individual. So this is the emphasis on individual rights, not on collective rights. I think that's an important feature of that movement. it's not us also. No, it's me also. It's me too. Literally me too. And as well as putting the individual in the center, that individual is one that represents white, middle class, young women, and many of them also are celebrities. So the criticism that can be made of that, of the hegemonic patriarchal ideas, is often done in an elitist way. It takes into account the rights of women, but basically women of upper classes and professionals and white women. And I think that is something we can criticize. Me Too suffers from the same weaknesses of equality feminism because it doesn't incorporate the demands that other groups make, and it doesn't take into account differentiation within women. It tends to focus on genital differences, and it doesn't take into account diversity. There's no commitment towards diversity. There are critical movements that come to us from the Global South, for example, Ni Una Menos, which started in Argentina, which is very inspiring and is much sharper and much more critical of the structures of our society. They deal with issues of racial violence and class violence and violence towards disabled. There are other violences which get missed as well, and they are trying to put them into the movement. And there are also unnoticed violences which do not fit into the male-female schema, and an issue that we need to maybe look at, whether there is a kind of sexuated violence. I'm not talking about sexual violence, or sexualized violence rather. Well, I want to just add an example from from Andalusia, where I'm from. You know about the Manada case here in Spain. I'm sure there's nobody here who doesn't know about that. But at the same time as that happened, there were abuses carried out against migrant farm laborers in Huelva, in Andalusia. These women were suffering harassment. They had come to work. You were saying that Me Too is very linked to the workplace because the celebrities that are denouncing the sexual harassment are denouncing harassment in their work experiences. But what about people who are working in the home and doing care work? What about those women that suffer abuses at the hands of the son of the grandfather that they're looking after? Are the home workers or domestic workers in Me Too? This is what is missing. So we're seeing this kind of intersecting of things, and I think this more intersectional approach is something that is there. There are so many things that need to be taken into account, and this new wave has actually pushed some of the intersectional approaches of the previous wave to one side and simplified the whole issue of oppression. We've seen conquests in recent years. There have been public policies passed. We have councilorships and ministries of feminism, which didn't exist before. Feminism is not just a social movement. We now have studies in the university on feminism, but we've had the institutional experiences of recent years. A series of feminist policies have been passed. So I'd like to know, what is your evaluation of that experience? First of all, what do you think of what has been achieved through the institutions? And secondly, Maybe you could talk about what happens in the street, because once in the institutions may affect what happens in the streets, and there have been debates that have continued in the movement, and things have been made public. There's been a very clear polarization of certain debates, and we have, as we were saying before, that has meant that other debates have been hidden. So I'd like to know what you think about all of those debates, for example, of the law C or C, the yes or yes law about consent, about the approach of retributionism or punishing gender inequality through the courts. And what about these debates? What about the debates we're still having? Shall I start? Yes? Okay. Because I think maybe Miriam, you can say some more interesting things about what's happening on the street and what is the movement from the street to the institutions and the movement from the institutions to the street. So one of the thoughts I want to share is that I think the fact that they have councilorships and ministries of feminism, I think that's a social conquest. That's something we've achieved. Since the beginning of feminism, this has been a battleground. I think these ministries, etc., are sometimes met with surprise or misunderstanding. But even then, there's much more acceptance of them than we would have had many years ago. During the debate to invest the new government, we've seen some of the controversies around that. But the fact that feminism is still present in the institutions as organs of government, I think that's a conquest. We know that the state body is a male body, and you will say it's the state body. Well, no, it is male, and it's a male, it's a man with a capital M, because it's a body that's built to the size of men, and it is being created through violence, using imposition, segregation, and even annihilation. In modern constitutions, however, and this is an issue that's in vogue at the moment, there are fundamental laws which structure our society and all of its dynamics. They bring together exclusive conceptions which come from the classical thought and which legitimate democracy. For example, the early democracy in Athens, which of course, as we know, women didn't participate, or children, or slaves. In this case, the political subject, which literally is that capital letters man. The man with capital letters is the only one who has the statute of the citizen. This might seem surprising to us that that existed, but we still have some remains of that history affecting us today. We often know that social relations that are led through the state, which is a male body, and when states were founded, these social relations were founded based on what Carol Bateman called a sexual contract, not a social contract. And that is carried out through the subjectification or submission of women and their bodies. And you can see Carol Bateman's text, which is very clear on that. Bateman explicitly says what is the tacit agreement that has accepted behavior of men and women over the millennia to continue the patriarchal system in the workplace, in the home, in schools, and in the family. We have seen how this relationship, this contract manifests itself through the division of labor, through state services, and in terms of wage differences between men and women. These public bodies show that feminism, where we can see feminist participation today, feminism has had to cross some very thick walls in order to be able to bring practices into the institutions. They're not just opposing practices that are, or sexist practices that occur outside the institutions, but also those that occur inside the institution. We can see when policies are applied, both locally or nationally, that there is an attempt to restore women's subjectivity, or other men of men, because men is diverse, to create this new political subject. Changes have been made. And the third is transformation, not just social and institution, but also, not just cultural, but also institutional and social, in order to create this new political subject. Many laws, such as the only yes means yes law, is an example. So there have been many institutions doing this change. Miriam, you have more experience in public policies. Can you change the master's home with the tools of the master? But this is, and there's also the way that these institutions have been created over millennia. Can you change that through within? Just a couple of weeks ago, there was an act organized by the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, which organized an activity in Zaragoza, which asked whether the feminization of politics has run its ground. Is it over? It's a bit, God, we've just got here, and now they're talking about whether it's all ended. Remember, there was this slogan of feminizing politics with the new politics, and with these new town halls of change which were created. I'm talking about the left of the left. There was going to be a change in ways of doing things, and also the issues that would be talked about. That's right. There will be a change in these ways of operating, which Begoña has explained so well, these androcentric approaches and these sexist institutions that are solidified over centuries of history. And this attempt at feminization, or this term of feminizing politics, was useful to highlight the gender issue, but it was a very essentialist approach, because it wasn't just about incorporating women in the politics. Of course, we have to do that. Well, of course, we need to do that as basic democracy, to have women in politics. But it's, and feminist politics must go beyond parity and the glass ceiling, because it's great to have a glass ceiling, but what about the sticky floor? Who's fighting against that sticky floor? And furthermore, feminist policy against, or we could say that the feminization of policy 2.0 would be the feminization of policy. So we need to go beyond issues of gender. We need to deal with racism. We need to fight against LGBT phobia. We need to deal with many issues, because feminization of politics can't be about allowing some women to get to politics at the expense of others. This famous image of the woman who goes to the demonstration because she has someone, an immigrant, a woman who is looking after their children, so the first woman can go to the demonstration. And there's a whole issue of the global care supply shown in that example. So we're seeing a redistribution of power, or we need to see a redistribution of power and the resources to the majority. It must be, feminism must be a tool to defend the needs of everybody, of all women, particularly the poorest, particularly migrant, and particularly the most precarious, and the women who are unemployed, the women who are youngest, the elderly women. In many places, I think some important achievements have been achieved. For example, the Barcelona town hall managed to make some important changes. I was working as an advisor in the last term of office of Barcelona en Comú in that city, and we managed to bring in a free babysitter for women, and we were able to show that women who didn't have papers, undocumented migrants, could use services. There's a big issue with undocumentation because in Catalonia it's very clear that women who are migrants lose custody of their children when they have social problems. For example, they're working as sex workers. There's such a strong tendency for them to lose custody. So when they have the right to resources, they have to go through being checked. Imagine they go to a project which encourages women who are working on the street or trans women in the digital field, but they said when I go there, they said I'm only able to get a job cleaning toilets and earning a low amount of money, but they're now doing digital work and earning 2,000 euros a month. That is the feminization of politics, when we can achieve things like that. And the migrant women were often scared to go to get social services before because they might feel that they were in danger of losing custody of their children. So we're talking about a conflict which is there. There's the B side of feminism, which has been a conflict, which we've all seen, which with Carmen Calvo and Irene Montero, the two ministers, women ministers in the Spanish government, fighting over the portfolio. Carmen gave the equality portfolio to Irene Montero, and she did it poisoned. She was giving her a death sentence to that minister, to that woman. We saw that conflict that they had. We have seen that was effectively a fight over hegemony for different feminisms. They polarized the women's movement, issues that are always part of a non-closed debate in the feminist movement. These debates had always been there, but they'd never split the sea. Trans women were in the feminist movement since the 80s. No, before then. There was records of trans women involved in demonstrations and events and talks. But now these issues are dividing. And there's the issue of prostitution. Of course, there is the issue of that which is being instrumentalized as well. At the same time, if we point to those failures, it's very complicated because we have the extreme right with its shotgun about to be loaded, and its aim is to shoot against equality policies. So who can dare to do a criticism in that framework? Who can criticize equality measures when they are already at the eye of the hurricane? We need to be able to talk about our failures. We need to... You mean failures in the debate? What do you mean by failures? Well, maybe I can answer. Yeah, go for it. Because what you were presenting, I think what you've outlined, is that polarization. That's the word. A polarization of the debate. Polarization of policies and projects is always a failure. The androcentric or patriarchal logic is a dichotomous one of black or white, in favor or against. It's the Carl Schmitt idea of friend and enemy. And we have lost imagination. We have lost it loses the possibility of imagining other possibilities that weren't there at the beginning. I think failure happens when you cancel imagination, whether it's collective or creative or critical. I think that's where I think the failure takes place. We can see that in the polarization of politics. You said it very clearly. Calvo versus Montero, that was a failure. It's not just an issue of personalities or personalisms. It's an issue of dichotomies and logics. And it's sad when it's people who came to change things. That's right. So we need to ask who has benefited from a certain feminist agenda and who has been excluded from that. And we have seen a transformative feminism excluded from that. One that talks about the feminization of poverty, that talks about public care policies. Coming out of the pandemic, I think it's incredible that we've been in it for 4 years, talking about prostitution, trans, and I don't know what else, the feminism of politics. We've come out of the pandemic. We had this wonderful opportunity to talk about having a public care system. This was the glue that would have kept us going in that period. But we're not having that debate. These debates should be there. We haven't put imagination into how we can put that into political agendas. What about the aliens law? This is a law which is the biggest sexist violence. It is the pimp law. It is what creates those vulnerabilities for women. We have not talked about health. We've not talked about public education. We've not talked about health. We've not talked about the Kelly domestic workers. We haven't talked about use of times. We've not created a transformative agenda. So that's the heart of what I'm saying, an agenda which transforms things for everybody. In that regard, in terms of general and principal positions, there's the issue of straitjacketing the feminist discourse according to a dichotomous logic, which becomes very enclosed in itself. Either this is feminism or not. I think that's been a difficulty. I think that feminism deserves being in plural. It needs to be able to articulate itself in a plural way. It must spill away from this either it is or it isn't approach. Feminism needs to use its critical potential and think the diversity is part of that. It is against single thought. I think it is a mirage to think that saying one or the other breaks with this single thought. That is the logic of single thought. You're either with me or against me. That's the approach. And we need to break with that. Feminism can do that. When we talk about feminism, we're talking about difference and diversity, and also promoting dialogue in all of the different ambits that you've talked about. It is pushing negotiation and social and political and cultural enrichment. It is the unnegotiable basis for change. And I also want to call for dissent. It's good to reach consensus. Of course, we need to celebrate them as well. But even more important is to demand having dissent as a feminist practice or even feminist method. First, as an antidote to the homogenization or uniformness that is there in political discourses. It treats everyone as the same. I think it doesn't matter whether you do that in gender or any other issues, that there's not one single approach. We will come on to the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, and we'll look back at that. There is that homogenizing discourse which treats everyone as equal to the same and having the same needs and therefore having the same demands. And this is problematic. And there's also this massification approach. Sometimes we insist on talking about feminism as a mass phenomenon. What are we saying when we say that? When we say it is a mass phenomenon, it means that we give the mass this statute of political subject. What are we saying when we say that? This is not innocuous. And what are we looking at when we are saying that? Exactly. So I want to insist that dissent as an antidote to massification is important, and also the differentiation, I think that's important. Differentiation is important because not every feminist movement is the same and as good as another. Not every movement is good. Not every demand is as good as another. We need to say that all demands must be in their context, must be located. We must try and pass, there's this idea that we should pass mainstream political or feminist policies. This is there in the political agenda. That means that, again, this is a majority approach based on the mass, which excludes, almost by definition, the minorities. Debates, I think, are a useful tool. We shouldn't demonize them, not just to transform things, but also to make people aware they are politically and ethically necessary. At the same time, that doesn't mean there shouldn't be consensus and we shouldn't try and get consensus and celebrate them. Of course we should. There have been consensuses with importance, for example, those regarding radical and feminist consensuses in the Catalan women's movement, for example, through Caledona, the organization. And also there are issues around trans rights, which unfortunately have been broken. And we need to make explicit that there were these consensuses around trans rights in the past. We need to do a bit more genealogy and have more historical memory within feminist movement. The last block would be about your thoughts. You've been explaining around the relationship between the institutions and the street and the dissents that can be there regarding the feminist viewpoint, and looking for a continuous debate. That's something that should be done or is being done. But this event is part of the SDGs on gender and the aim of achieving these goals by 2030, including gender equality. So you've talked about everything that the feminist movement should do and call for, but is there I want you to now say whether you think this objective, this SDG, is enough. What do you think about it? It is, and what kind of viewpoint do you have? Is it enough to have a feminist viewpoint in order to move towards that objective of gender equality by 2030? It feels like we've been talking about gender equality for a long time. And also I want to ask you, where does masculinity fit into that? We haven't really talked about that yet. This is a debate that's very strong now. It's also an issue about how it fits into the future. So what do you think can happen in the future in feminism, and what will be the debates that need to take place? I don't know whether they're challenges or the debates that will take place in the future. I've been trying to think about where would I like feminism to be as soon as possible, because we're not that far off 2030. Oh my God, scary. We have a certain urgency. God, it's almost 2030. Wow. We have urgency because the far right is here. It is in our institutions. Today it was enjoyable listening to Abascal. They are in the leader of Vox. They are everywhere. I hope they're not in your beds, but you'll be happier if they're not in your beds. The far right. I think we have two pending tasks, or two which come from a single bigger one. One is to be critical with your own tendency, essential and identitarian tendencies, because that is what stops alliances from taking place. Obviously, alliances require dissent, because you wouldn't need an alliance if there wasn't dissent in the first place. And basically, one of the critical potential strengths that the movement has is it's able to have this dissent, but it's not always able to apply it to itself. So it's arguing that society should take into account difference and dissent, but not always applying it to itself. So we don't want to fall into the same mistake of patriarchy. But there are two elements that thwart this identitarian or existentialist delusion. And by the way, all of these criticisms I'm making are not just towards the feminist movement, but all movements can fall into these delusions. So I will tiptoe around the issue of trans rights, but there has been an attempt over decades that trans have asked about the separation of the male and women gender when there's a lot more going on. Thank you for getting us away from that fantasy. Feminism cannot just be a very identitarian-based movement based on biological sex. Those who want to do this kind of feminist politics, we don't want to be caught up in identity politics. There is an issue which Laia has mentioned, which is the woman subject of feminism. It's true, the relationship with masculinity historically has been complex. So we have clear that we are diverse as women, we have different origins, different races, and men are treated as a uniform subject. They are all treated as all the same. And if women are diverse, of course, men are diverse. So that idea is wrong. We need to talk about a category, men, which is not homogeneous. Not all men have the same power. Saying that is sacrilegious, isn't it? We can't have this idea of this universalist idea of men as being this unified oppressor and women with different disabilities and races and other features. But actually there is division between men, there is power relations between men and other men. Feminism also needs to talk about that. The emancipation of rights that feminism is asking for should also be applied for men. We need to have an approach that gives emancipation to most men. Otherwise, the far right will come along and take advantage. So we have to be a bit bitchy in order to make sure, we have to be a bit sneaky to make sure that we put someone forward so that the far right don't come along and say, hey, we've got a proposal for you men. The far right is creating an army of angry men. I think it was Michael Kimmel wrote a book called Angry White Men about that. There are many men who don't fit into the masculinity precepts. There are more men that don't fit into those. They don't fit in because they're fat, or they have a small one, or because they're racialized, or because they don't earn enough money, because they're the school sucker, because they like anal sex, or there's lots of reasons. There's millions of reasons why they would not fit in to the feminism sells as the privileged man. But actually there are very few privileged men, in fact. And in this conflict, to represent the crisis of masculinity, the far right are doing a good job. From their terms, they are making a promise to these men. They're saying, we're going to put you back. You remember that Trump slogan by the one that was recovered by, about making America great again. Trump did that, and he's doing this, and they're doing the same with masculinity. They're saying, make men great again. We need to make promises. We need to promise things. As Marina Garcés argued, the far right are making promises to men. And the key thing is to making society and men understand that the crisis of masculinity does not come because of feminism or migration or LGBT people, but it comes because of capitalist disposition processes that are driven by neoliberalism, where they are dispossessed of things. The problem is there. It is real. And we need to give a response to that. There needs to be a narrative about that. We do not want to hand over the battle to our enemies, because at the moment, those that are winning the argument that the crisis of masculinity is because of migrants and feminists, and they're ignoring the role of ferocious neoliberalism. We need to propose emancipatory narratives to explain the crisis of masculinity. So my commitment will be to change our discourse before 2030, yeah? Yeah, we've got 6 years to change the discourse on masculinity. I think you'll have to respond. Could you respond? But we don't have that much time. I just want to mention that feminisms have shown that there is an experience of men. I do want to respond by saying that I do think men have a degree of privilege, even though there are different degrees of such. There is some uniformness. I'll give you an example. I've got a very fun gay male friend, and he's a feminist militant. And someone says to him, "How many times have you gone out to run late night, out for a run? How many times have you had to leave a nighttime bar or other spot because someone is undressing you with their eyes?" And that's because men aren't treated the same way as women. And that's what his friends say to him. Even they criticize him as being feminist when he says he's feminist, and with those arguments. And it's true that there are some particular experiences that women have. Of course, it's not the way the far right looks at things. They just want to get more power. And we also need to avoid any attempt to get false power or false emancipation struggles based on power. Okay, returning to the 2030 agenda goals, the aim is to get gender equality and empower all women and girls. And it says that gender equality is not only a fundamental human right, but a necessary foundation for a peaceful, prosperous and sustainable world. So this is an objective that's not just commendable, but also a very important one, because, but I wouldn't say, I don't think the objective is to get equality, but to dismantle inequalities. And you'll say, that's a play on words and it's ridiculous. But I think it's really the case. We need to either look at the emphasizing equality or inequalities. And I think it's much more important to do the latter. The aim is to make sure that the inequalities that privilege men before others, not just women, but also animals, and there are many others who are not privileged, and these inequalities are real and their effects are tragic. We need to take into account the effect of sexual violence, which devastate women. Look at the feminicides that are taking place. The Agenda 2030 includes local and regional governments and the national equality ministers that all deal with equality. The institutions are to structure themselves around a moral and ethical basis to bring in policies, and they need to look to watch over the application of equality. But I think the most important thing is that they need to watch over to make sure that there aren't any inequalities. So that's the emphasis for me, that they watch over to stop inequalities and eradicate them. Another thing is to hold equality as a flag without taking into account that, okay, it's good to talk about equality, but sometimes it's treated just as a political strategy. What do I mean by that? Leia, you asking, is there enough with that objective of gender equality if we're looking at 2030 agenda? If we think about this matter, instead of talking about equality, we could talk about gender and to what extent gender must be present as a kind of demand, not just in this objective 5 of the SDGs, but in all of the objectives for the SDGs. There are voices and groups that have been critical regarding this value of equality as the only value for feminisms. If we think about radical feminism or the feminism of differences, or black feminism or trans feminism, the different waves, there is a lack of a genealogical perspective. Equality is just one value, which is being privileged and leaving to one side all of this genealogy of different feminisms. And they don't talk about equity, they always talk about equality. But that's another issue as well, you're totally right. So how can we spin this to talk about equality? But I think, I talk about equality, but we need to think critically of that. There's also a lack of intersectionality, as you mentioned, Leia, which considers difference not just in terms of biological terms, but in terms of race and ethnicity, etc. This is another issue. There is a Agenda 2030, which is a UNESCO cultural, which nobody is talking about. So there's a cultural approach. If we don't try and get these goals without thinking about how to change culture, can you imagine? We won't be changing things before 2000. the year 5000, not by 2030. So these are monolithical proposals which are useful to mainstream proposals. And that also has relevant weaknesses. What challenges should feminism have beyond the 2023 agenda? I think transversality of gender is fundamental. That means doing it not just as an issue or problem, but as an object or goal, but as a method. It should be a way of thinking in all fields, in institutions, in the academia, in the academic world rather, everywhere. I think that for me it's important to think about the academic world in that world. It is a place in which you share knowledge, but where knowledge should not mean giving less importance to other knowledge. That has often been systematically the case, and even some thoughts have been pathologized. We need to promote a feminist culture which is not exclusive and which has this character of building a network. We haven't talked about the neo-materialist feminisms or the post-human feminisms, but I'm talking about going beyond and the Agenda 2030 doesn't do this trans-individual approach, and that it is what is needed. We need to go beyond an individual feminism to a trans-individual feminism. Okay, well, I think we have talked about feminism as a method and not just as an object, and applying a viewpoint of feminist culture. So I've got that idea, but I just want to see whether you want to share a thought or want to ask for clarification or going more in depth into something. We have 5 minutes of open mic, let's say. I'd also like to thank all of you who've allowed us to go on, and you've been putting up with that. Nobody's left, nobody's moved. So could you provide a microphone for the people who are connecting to the streaming on the internet? Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you to the three of you because you've given very interesting speeches. So everything that we've talked about, the far right and the right, and how I think they are creating an international network. What is happening is not just happening here, but in all countries, in all Western countries. I think we also need to react as a network, us feminisms. And I think maybe we need to work in that regard as well, internationally through networks. Let's take a few questions and then they'll come back, okay? If you're okay with that. Hi, good afternoon. I will talk in Spanish because I express myself better in Spanish. I wanted to say this book, Alianzas Rebeldes, I will read it and I want to applaud that book. I want to also applaud the thought that you shared at the end, because I've been working on a feminist anthropology and we have been working on building a new world in all fields, and I think the cultural aspect is essential. It's a new paradigm. It is what we are building through the different positions. We might recognize that there are many feminisms, but we are, together, a proposal of a new paradigm. That's what we are proposing. I would like to come down to the ground. We are in Manresa. We're in Valles. We're in central Catalonia, the heart of Catalonia. We have the best legislations, don't we? I think they're the most advanced in Europe in terms of gender. Yes, among the best. Yes, among the best. Well, they're really at the front line. But we are in Valles. I've been living here for 3 years and little more. And I'm still surprised by many things. For example, just 2.5 years ago, a monument called the Monument of Future was opened, and we have it there opposite the new law courts of Manresa. 3 times it has been taken away, it has been damaged, and it is our heritage, it's our patrimony. All of us who live in Manresa, that's the first thing. I think this deserves a good article about this. It's what is the monument? So could you explain? We don't know. Okay, so this is a monument which is called the Monument for the Future, which was opened on 8th of March, the Women's Day, not long back, and the first didn't last a month. And the demand was to put it in front of the law courts because they were closing cases related to women. There was this aberration that we've talked about, and crimes such as the manada. And there's been other ones that have happened here 14 years ago. And so there was an attempt to denounce this sexual slavery and the impunity that perpetrators have, thanks to the legal institutions. Of course, other institutions do similar. But I'm still surprised to see other issues. For example, just a year ago, in the square near here, in the center, in the old part of the city, a religious group was praying to preserve masculinity. Can you believe it? Preserving masculinity. And another important thing that happened is that the Jesuits who live in the Cova de San Ignacio, and one of them has had more than 100 complaints against him for sexual abuse of students. But he was welcomed in the school. So the town is actually allowing pedophiles to come to the town. We've had people who've been investigated for this, so we're often forgetting in the feminist discourses, we are ignoring all of these collateral victims of those perpetrators, and they are the daughters of neighbors, and they were children when it happened. So imagine what happened to, and that happened to children. It can't happen that a welcoming town welcomes also pedophiles. All the institutions here are proposing tourism to visit religious facilities, but they're allowing pedophiles to come here. Nobody's taken them to the court. Does the retributional approach cause controversy? Yes, the punitive approach, but sometimes you need to punish people. But I think non-punitive institutions we've had all our life, the family and the church, they have been non-punitive institutions, right? I know I'm talking a lot, I'm sorry. Yeah, you will have to wind up because we don't have much time left. So I think there are issues which are very, so I haven't been here for long. Here in Manresa, I'm still getting to know the place. But I'm still getting surprised. And that's all I wanted to say. Well, thank you. Thank you for that thought. So we don't have many minutes. Does anyone else want to say anything? Good afternoon, everybody. I normally don't speak in public because it should be the public in general that should speak, because I'm a counsellor, and my job as a counsellor is to collect ideas from people's interventions. But I do want to say it's true that we have this statue in Manresa, and it's been taken 3 times away. Taken away 3 times. We put materials to prevent that happening again, but that does not stop the fact that we are still demanding that statue to be there in the same format, or maybe having another sculpture. We are talking to the artist to make sure there is something there in that space in our city. Regarding this group that met, it's true, they did do that, the religious group, but it's also true that many citizens came and showed their rejection of that prior session. I think that's what the act was, wasn't it? Yeah, I'm not exactly sure, because they ended up cancelling it, so I'm not sure exactly what they were planning, but there were many individuals and collectives that turned up to show their rejection of that. And regarding the last case that you mentioned, I don't think the city welcomes, certainly not voluntarily, to people that have committed crimes against children or women. And I know that the justice system should be intervening, of course. But we have I'm sure we have a lot of work to do, but we are a city that is trying to make demands. Oh, well, that was amazing. We got a quick response to that intervention from the councillor. Actually, it's not my area, but yeah, I was happy to answer. Okay, so there was a question there. I don't know. Maybe we would just settle with that. Is there no other question? No? Okay, so can you remember the question regarding the networks against the far right? For me, the key thing is, if we don't lower the identity aspect of our movements and closedness, by the way, Alianzas Rebeldes is published by Bellaterra. It's in Spanish, but it was produced here in our homeland. But I think we need to get out of this logic of ascribing ourselves to doing politics around shared identities and not around common objectives. These alliances, despite being transformative, but they need to take place, or alliances need to take place based on where we want to go, not on what we are. That's what we should do. The far right will put us all in the same box. They treat us blacks, gays, puffs, etc. We're all in the same dikes. We're all in the same bag for them. So if we separate ourselves according to identity tickets, I'm not saying that we've reached the end of identity politics. It's a strategy, but it should be applied when the context is right. And I think these alliances are urgent and necessary. And also I think that these feminist alliances are not at the moment between women. They're not just between women. They are between feminisms and riders and the women farm workers, people who are fighting for housing or against climate change, with workers from Amazon and pensioners, and for people trying to get papers. That is what the alliances should be with, not to strengthen feminist identities. So it's a transversalization of the women, of the feminist outlook. Yes, that's what I think. I think networks are really important. I think there's an element that we need to add, though, which is the affective element. When I talk about affective, I mean affection, which is very elementary. I'm thinking about that definition that we know of the relationship between eros and thanatos. Feminisms need to pay attention to effectiveness against the neoliberal and patriarchal logics. There needs to be a concretization of affection. Thanatos went to hatred, and the hatred today is misogyny. We need to know that that's there, and this needs to shape our relations, our institutions, and our practices. I think this misogyny, you were asking for a counter-offensive against the right. We could think about the counter-offensive not just in terms of war or war against the far right. We can think about how we can collectively provide alternatives, both also as an effective practice. How can we how can we take away the neoliberal and patriarchal effective logic? Jean-Luc Nancy wrote a very interesting book called The Tragic Skin of the World, which says that what has happened is that we have lost the meaning of the world because we've stopped feeling ourselves. Sentir is the word in Catalan, says the translator. It means both to touch and to hear, but I'm talking about the touching aspect as well. This emotional connection can be an erotic politic, or eros policy of sensibility and of feeling ourselves. I don't know. Maybe we could try that. It is really a challenge to summarize at this late hour with so many issues, but I hope that in some way you will take from this some thoughts, because we've been talking about not just from 2018, we've got to 2030, and we could continue talking more about more issues and more time. And the aesthetics of eroticism. All these things are so necessary and need to be dealt with more, including effective relationships. So thank you so much for coming and being with us for this hour and a half. Thanks to the Manresa Town Hall for inviting us. Thanks to COSMÓGRAF for thinking about a talk like this and contacting us and putting us in touch, and for this pleasure of being able to talk about these issues. And to all of you for being here and making the effort of coming.